Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are diving into a really fascinating, honestly pretty complex piece of source material. We're unpacking an extensive interview with Sergeant Nicholas Irving, and he's evaluating the sheer speed and scale of events defining the 47th presidency. We're going to look closely at the timeline from January 2025 into early 2026. Think about it. How does an administration start on day one laser-focused on domestic reform and then rapidly pivot to launching back-to-back global military operations? Well, today we are breaking down Irving's impartial scorecard of that first year. We'll map out exactly what was promised, what was actually delivered, and how those decisions are literally rippling across the globe as we speak.
And that brings us to the central question of today's Explainer. How exactly did a platform built so heavily on domestic change, deregulation, border security, how did that evolve so incredibly fast into a 10-week ongoing and seemingly stalled conflict in Iran? By tracing the through line of this source material, we can actually connect the dots between those early perceived political victories at home and the immense pressure cooker that led to some serious overseas escalation.
Okay, let's dive into this timeline, because the sheer speed of these events is absolutely crucial for understanding our current geopolitical landscape. Irving maps out this breathless sequence. In January 2025, the administration takes office and immediately launches massive domestic shifts, like those global tariffs. Then, exactly 1 year later, boom, January 2026, the U.S. military launches Operation Absolute Resolve in Venezuela. And then, less than a month after that, in February 2026, Operation Epic Fury kicks off in Iran. To really understand how we landed in this massive conflict, we've got to rewind and look at the domestic environment that set the stage.
So, let's start by looking at Irving's domestic scorecard for the administration's first year in office.
Irving evaluates three major domestic pillars here. First up, border security. The administration claims a 90% drop in encounters through mass deportations. Now, Irving gives this a half check. He suggests the numbers are probably a bit fluffed and the mass roundups were pretty localized, though he absolutely acknowledges some real action was taken. Next, the 10% global tariff gets a solid check for promises kept, although he points out that those promised $2,000 tariff checks for everyday citizens, those are quickly forgotten. Finally, the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. Irving gives this one a hard X. He actually calls it a publicity stunt, arguing that firing a few federal workers didn't even put a tiny dent in the nation's absolutely massive $37 trillion deficit.
Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast between the execution of social policy versus the energy realities on the ground. Irving gives a firm check to the administration for aggressively executing its social agenda, specifically moving to close the Department of Education and rolling out widespread bans on DEI programs. But on the flip side, despite all the drill baby drill rhetoric we heard, Irving points out that Americans are seeing unprecedented gas prices. We're talking California prices right in the heart of Texas. Meanwhile, he notes the U.S. is acting like, quote, pirates abroad to secure oil, completely failing the energy independence test. That aggressive search for resources leads us straight into January 2026 and Operation Absolute Resolve in Venezuela.
Now, this operation aimed to oust Nicolas Maduro and disrupt the drug trade. And sure, the stated successes were indeed achieved. Maduro and his wife were captured, and the U.S. secured some highly favorable metrics regarding Venezuelan oil. But the realities on the ground, they tell a somewhat different story. Irving only awards this operation a half check, primarily because the global drug trade, which remember was a massive justification for going in, well, it remained completely unchanged. Still, this perceived victory down in Venezuela might have dangerously inflated the administration's confidence moving forward.
Which brings us to the primary focus of today's analysis, Operation Epic Fury.
Let's look at the official justification for this 10-week conflict. The administration presented a very specific, ticking clock kind of threat to the American public. They alleged Iran possessed 970 pounds of uranium, enriched to 60%. Supposedly, this granted them the immediate capability to build 10 to 12 nuclear bombs. But the absolute most alarming metric pushed to the public? The timeline. The administration claimed Iran was simply, quote, 2 weeks away from being a fully fledged nuclear threat.
So, the crucial point is, how is this intelligence actually perceived by military veterans? Well, Sergeant Irving expresses some seriously deep skepticism. He directly compares this Iran intelligence to the 2003 Iraq weapons of mass destruction playbook. He's suggesting the numbers were heavily inflated just to justify the conflict. He even goes a step further, analyzing that the administration didn't necessarily want this war initially, but they were heavily pressured by foreign lobbying and specific allied leaders into entering a completely unnecessary conflict.
And this brilliantly illustrates the practically impossible dilemma the U.S. is facing right now. We are 10 weeks in, the uranium hasn't been found, and the alleged ceasefires, they've completely failed. So the administration is totally trapped between two brutal options. Option 1, escalation. The U.S. could unleash new, heavier waves of bombings, risking a drawn-out, decades-long war. Or option 2, humiliation. The U.S. could simply tuck tail, leave the Strait of Hormuz, and appear incredibly weak on the global stage, essentially signaling to adversaries that America lacks the stomach to finish what it starts.
A major reason a peaceful resolution seems so utterly impossible right now is the sheer human cost of the initial retaliation. Remember those decapitation strikes on February 28th? They reportedly killed the Iranian Supreme Leader's father, mother, and wife. Irving argues that by making the strikes this deeply, deeply personal, the U.S. entirely eliminated any chance of a diplomatic off-ramp. It hardened the death to America ideology beyond repair. I mean, it practically guarantees that Iranian leadership will absolutely never negotiate, concede, or cry uncle.
Let's move on and see how this builds into the war economics and the subsequent political fallout. $30 million. That number is truly staggering. According to Irving, big oil companies are reportedly profiting $30 million an hour directly from this conflict. This highlights a pretty dark reality. War is a wildly lucrative business. Think about it. When major corporations and defense contractors are generating $30 million of pure profit every single hour, there is a massive systemic financial incentive to just keep the conflict rolling, rather than genuinely seeking peace. But then, you have to contrast that insane corporate profit with the reality on the ground for everyday Americans. While oil companies are raking in millions, Irving observes that regular gas in Texas hit $4.22 a gallon. Experiencing California-level gas prices right in the heart of oil country, that absolutely shatters the administration's promise of domestic economic relief and energy independence. It is directly hitting the wallets of the very voters who put them in office in the first place. And as you might expect, that economic pain is translating straight into political disaster. Before the operation, the president actually enjoyed an approval rating sitting somewhere near 50%. But today, because of the stalled war and these soaring domestic costs, that approval rating has plummeted to 32%. And current sentiment suggests it might even be dropping lower than that. This timeline really shows the immense pressure cooker the administration is currently trapped inside. We are over 10 weeks deep into a totally stalled conflict, and midterm elections are only 6 months away. On top of that, reports are indicating that the MAGA base is actively fracturing. Voters are feeling alienated, not just by the broken promise of no new wars, but also by domestic failures, like the administration's refusal to fully disclose the Epstein files. Time is rapidly running out for them to change this narrative. Which leaves us with this final, lingering question. The administration is caught right between a rock and a hard place. They've got a war they can't seem to win, an enemy that absolutely refuses to negotiate, soaring domestic costs, and a looming electoral reckoning just around the corner. The analysis paints a really stark picture of a presidency that simply moved too fast from domestic reform to international intervention and is now paying a heavy price for it. So what will it take to find an off-ramp? Or is escalation literally the only path forward? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep questioning the headlines, and we will see you next time.